Thank you for downloading this RealAgriculture podcast. Excite your crops with inputs from Excite Bio. Access nitrogen and phosphorus with Excite Bio's lineup of inoculants and ag biologicals. Since 2010, they've been helping farmers harness the power of the soil. Learn more at excitebio.ca. That's XITEBIO.ca.
Joining us right now to talk about the markets and maybe a little bit of a reaction to what we saw last night in the U.S. election and how that impacts some of the commodities is Neil Townsend of Grainfox. Hey, Neil, how are we doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Okay. Hey, we'll start there. Markets kind of opened flat this morning. What do you think, the reaction from market perspective to a second Trump presidency?
Well, I mean, you can see like the stock market, the equities are sort of way up. Oil's down a little bit under theory, like drill, baby, drill. But I think the space that we care the most about, the commodity space, grains, oil seeds, pulses, those kinds of things, like I think the general feel was that it's a little bit negative, probably because it injects a lot of uncertainty into the whole complex. I would caution a little bit and say, like, it's a little bit of a wait and see approach. Like, we don't really know what the policies will be for agriculture. We don't know how much of the more belligerent things Trump said during the campaign were just like, sorry, that's my phone. We don't know how much, like, the harsh tariffs and those, like, are those going to be reality, or was that just campaigning? There is a difference between what you say on the campaign trail and what actually happens. So, and, it'll be interesting, though. I don't think, obviously, some people expected it. Some people didn't expect it. It's still the decisiveness of his victory, I think, caught a lot of people by surprise.
Yeah. And, we can expect some pretty hard-nosed action on from a trade perspective. Now, I think a lot of times in Canada, we reflect that, that has to do with us, and it no doubt will in some regards. But it's also going to be the case in other markets around the world. And it's going to be interesting to watch how this plays out between the U.S. and China, and where Canada kind of fits in that three-legged stool as maybe one of the weaker pieces of it, or at least the least amount of leverage. We've been in this predicament before. That has an impact on Canadian exports too. It could be maybe an opportunity, but also could go against us as well.
Yeah, I think one of the questions I would have for, say, the next 24 months and beyond is, obviously global trade relationships between China and the U.S. That's the headline. How belligerent is it going to get? The other question I think we should all have, and this is something that's unfolding in real time, is just like, what will China look like in 24 months or in 36 months? They've had such a difficulty to kickstart their economy after the pandemic. And you start to think, well, okay, 1 year is okay, give them 1 year, give them 2 years, give them 3 years. But when you get into sort of the fourth or fifth year, like, you got to think, is this more of the directionality that Japan went once they hit sort of the 1990s, where they just started to have stagnation and stagflation because, the demographics were working against them. So I do think the China-US issue is huge, but I think China in and of itself is something that, from a Canadian perspective, we're going to have to watch very carefully, because we've sort of counted on them for being this market. The world's counted on them for being this market to mop up sort of some of the surplus. I mean, are they going to be that market, when we're sitting here talking in 2031 or something like that? And I think that as much as the U.S. administration matters, I mean, I think China is a huge, huge question mark.
Yeah. Do you expect there to be Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola at some point in 12 months?
If you'd asked me that question a month ago, I probably would have said 100%. Now I'm sort of more down in the 60-70% range on that, just because it seems like there's been some wording from Canada in and of itself that maybe we're thinking of backing off on our EV tariffs. So that was one of the issues that, again, they're all unrelated things, supposedly. But, I think that's one of the sticks in the mud that China saw and didn't like. And there's really been no word since the initial sort of, hey, we're going to launch an investigation. We saw with Australia, like, the investigation did close the doors for barley into China. The whole process lasted 3 or 4 years. And in the end, they came to sort of an agreement, and they decided, like, okay, you're back in, you've got, most favored nation for barley again. I don't know. The other thing I would say is it really seems like China wants and in some ways needs the canola. So they've imported quite a bit more than they imported at this time last year. Apparently, their forward buying is still being fairly good. I mean, it's slowed considerably since the announcement was. So I just wonder if there's more ground there for some commonality and perhaps something can be worked out so that we don't go to the more you know, ballistic state of affairs. And then the other thing I would say is I think one thing that is in favor of Canada maybe not facing the most significant consequences is that the canola balance sheet is tight enough that maybe China doesn't have as much leverage in canola for at least the next 8 to 12 months. We don't know about 25, 26, 26, 27, because remember, if they do start the tariff process in January, it has a multi-year impact because it's such a slow process.
Yeah, how did that canola balance sheet, I've heard a wide range of forecasts in terms of where people think the final yield production number will work out to. I know when we talk to farmers here on Real Ag Radio, and especially on the Farmer Rapid Fire, disappointment for the most part across the prairies in terms of where the yields were relative to the expectations, even with a dialed back expectation after all that July heat. Do you have a number in mind when it comes to the canola production number?
Yeah, first of all, I love the Farmer Rapid Fire, and we love ground intelligence at Grainfox. Like we try to feed it up, and it fits very much in line with what I've heard on Real Ag and other places like that. It was a palatably disappointing crop, this canola. So we've heard some numbers of below 18 million tons. There was an article in, the Western Canadian farm media that said that. We're not there yet. Now, we kind of take a holistic approach to this supply and demand balance. Like things have to make sense to us. So one thing is if you're telling us that farmers only had, and this StatsCan told us they think that farmers only had like 700 or 800,000 tons on farm at the end of 23, 24, like that math doesn't work because they delivered like, 1.5 million tons in the first 4 weeks that we don't believe was, brand new production. We believe that probably came out of the bin or something like that. So, any way that you slice it, you have to figure out that the balance sheet is probably a little bit larger than what StatsCan says, but the production was not good this past year. And so our number is in about the 18.4 million ton range. I wouldn't want to bet very much cryptocurrency on that or any money, gold bars, whatever. I would just say that, the whole balance sheet has to work. And somehow it doesn't work if you're going to go with like a sub 18 million ton production and then the on-farm carry-in that Stats Canada has. Something doesn't really measure out there.
Before we wrap up here, what about corn and beans? What are you seeing there relative to a U.S. probably being a lot more boisterous on trade? That circles back to China a little bit.
Yeah.
And the playbook has been reduced exports because we're talking tough on trade, and then payments to farmers for compensation for, the trade war. We could see 2.0 of that.
Yes, exactly. I mean, we do forget that just prior to the pandemic, like there had been trade war, and then we got sort of, what was a pretty good deal for American farmers that Trump and his team negotiated. So, there was that, I can't remember the exact term of it, but 1.0 or phase one, I think it was, and then phase two. And these were big numbers that China had agreed to. So on the corn front, I think, one thing that will dictate U.S. policy is they have relative abundance right now. They have a lot of corn. Now they've been very aggressive in making export sales right now. But if it looks like they're staring down the barrel of another very large crop next year, to try to lose market access to critical markets is not, that great. Now, China hasn't actually bought that much corn from the U.S. this year. I mean, Mexico's, this gigantic market for them and seems to be a growing market for them. On the soybean front, I think the problem is a little bit more clear and present. I think that the soybean is very heavy at the moment. All of the stuff with biofuel, that's going to be sorted out in the next administration. There's going to be probably a very different view. There's probably going to be some big contention, even within groups of the Trump administration, Congress, Senate, about what to do with biofuel. And then the farmers will definitely want more of that to be either mopped up internally or better market access offshore. And again, that's not just a problem that, negotiation between the US and China can solve, because there's a third party there, South America, and they have no intention of not continuing to grow massive crops of soybeans. And, their farmers have economics staring them at the face too, with the real sort of getting obliterated lately. That makes it sort of, more attractive for the price in reals is going up, right? Not down at the moment. So the farmer there is, oh, well, I should plant more stuff. So it's going to be very dynamic. I think, you called me today on a Wednesday just after the U.S. election, sort of a surprising result in the sense of how definitive it was. I thought a lot of people thought that we'd be not knowing who the president was right now. It would be something where we'd have to count for several weeks and maybe even go to court. But it's Trump. And not only is it Trump, it's Trump with the Congress and it's Trump with the Senate. So, the House of Reps and the Senate. So, policy could be pretty dynamic in the next 24 months after, January 20th when he takes over.
Yeah, we already start talking about those 2026 midterms, right? Okay, we got about 30 seconds left. I'm going to talk about it later on Real Ag Radio today. Yeah. Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index. Farmers looking, are a good time to buy or to hold or to sell their commodities. A 121. Farmers a little bit more bullish on ag commodities than they were back in July. What does that tell you?
Yeah, I think they should be. I think we've seen some pretty big harvest pressure here around the world, most specifically in the United States. So, our general policy, we sold fairly aggressively to this point. So, on most of the commodities, we're 50 or 50+% sold. But at this immediate time, other than trying to make some sales in the feed market, for feed wheat or feed grains, we're maintaining strategic inertia. We think there's upside for this market. And again, we're cautiously optimistic, understanding that there's political risk, some geopolitical risk, and perhaps even some macroeconomic risk. But I think a definitive election result in some ways is preferable to the alternative.
Hey, great stuff, Neil. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.